just to get the meeting kicked off. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us this evening or this afternoon, depending on which coast you're on, or somewhere in between. I'm Martin Bullen. I'm the president of the new M chapter, non-geographic chapter of the BMW CCA. And you'll see on your screens Yves Delinsky, who's the treasurer, Esteban Valentin, who is our vice president, and then Jackie Jouret, our speaker, excuse me, Jackie Jouret, our speaker today, the French pronunciation, who will be regaling us with the tale of the development of the M1. Just a quick plug for the M chapter. As you may or may not know, we are a new chapter to the CCA, formed just this year, and just getting started. Unfortunately, of course, the whole pandemic situation has rather compromised our ability to hold events, so we're focusing on these virtual events to start. At the moment, we're opening them up to all BMW CCA members so that you can get a sense of the sort of things that we're intending to do. I would invite you to join the chapter if you're not already a member. You can add it to your existing membership for only $15 a year. We have a very active Facebook group. We also have a web page which will be growing in substance. At the moment, there's very little there, but that web page does have the information on how to join the chapter. mchapter.org, is that right, Esteban? Yeah. So you can see us there, and also you could just call the national office of BMW CCA and ask them to add you. So with all that said, let's kick things off. Jackie is going to be speaking to us today, and I'm going to hide a couple of videos so that we can focus, so that you can all focus on just Jackie for the moment. I intend to act as a moderator for this, so use the question and answers area to send any questions that you might have for Jackie during the course of this. You'll find there's a little box, I think, at the bottom of your Ring Central window in order to do that. I will do my best during the course of this to field the questions, to combine ones if they're similar, and then to present them to Jackie. We'll let Jackie present and then move on to the Q&A after that. We also have a few slides to run through as well. So let me get started with sharing my screen. And everybody should be seeing about Jackie Jouret at this point. Jackie, can you confirm that? Are you seeing that?
I do see that. Okay,
great. So just to introduce Jackie, most of us will know her from at least from the Rondell and from BIMA Life, where she is. I believe you're editor in chief of the.
I'm the guest editor for the national section.
Okay, and as a columnist and feature writer for Rondell. Prior to that, Jackie was, this is where I first noticed you, was as the editor for BIMA magazine, which ran through 2017. Jackie's also an author for the BMW CCA Foundation, 4 books that you can see there, and also has a couple of her own books. And she's a lifelong, pardon me, a lifelong automotive enthusiast as well. So behind the happy smiling face, there's also a couple of Jackie's books there that you have the opportunity to buy, probably on Amazon, or
yeah.
Please support your local bookseller first and foremost.
It's all Amazon, sorry.
My wife's a publishing consultant and I had to get the plug in. But the real story behind the 2002 and the story of finding Elvis's 507, which another story full of intrigue and twists and turns. And then at the end of this, I'd like to give Jackie the opportunity to talk about a third book, which is apparently in the works right now. So that's pretty exciting. So right now, on to the M1. Jackie, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to start out with a disclaimer, which is that I would never present myself as an expert on the history of the M1. You know, Martin asked me to speak about this topic, and I have written about it quite a lot. I've driven a number of M1s, but there are probably people in this audience who know more about the M1 than I do, because there are obsessives about each model, and this is always the case. There are people who have, you know, all the relevant facts and figures to hand. I don't necessarily, but what I would like to present is some background and some context that will make the M1 more comprehensible within the larger picture of BMW as a whole, and to illustrate how some of the characters and some of the other events of that time really, you know, made the car what it was, which was both, I think, a success and a failure. So with that in mind, I would like to actually start not in 1978 when the first M1 is built, but we really have to touch on a few things that happened, you know, much earlier. First of all, 1959, BMW nearly goes bankrupt. It's saved by Herbert Quandt, but the company really is running on fumes until the Neue Klasse sedan proves to be a big hit. And once that happens, and then once they introduce the 1600-2, the company is really successful. In fact, they're so successful that they run out of production capacity in Munich, and they have to buy the Hans Glas GmbH in order to acquire more production capacity. So toward the end of the 1960s, they've purchased this outdated factory really to get the labor force and to get some technology and to get the skilled people, but they're pouring a ton of money into building the new factory at Dingolfing, which became the first home of the 5 Series car. Now, at the same time, that I think, I want to say the first car rolled off the line in Dingolfing in 1971. So you can see that's like a 5-year trajectory of a lot of, you know, a huge investment, really. At the same time, the Olympics are going to happen in Munich. So BMW, again, decides to make a big investment and to really make a statement of its presence in Munich by building this spectacular headquarters building. So here's more, you know, bazillions of dollars being poured into making what we call the 4-cylinder building. So 1972, that finally, it doesn't actually open for another year, I don't think, but that finally becomes, you know, structurally visible as the thing that it is. And that coincides with the arrival of Bob Lutz as head of sales and marketing on the board. And Bob Lutz, as I'm sure you guys all know, especially those of you who are in the Midwest, is an automotive legend. And the reason he's an automotive legend is because he is an enthusiast par excellence, as well as being, you know, a capable executive and an MBA. And he's famous for always sticking up for the enthusiast when it comes to making exciting products. And one of his first acts is actually a marketing move, and that is to establish BMW Motorsport. And so he joins the board at the very beginning of 1972 or 1971, I can't remember, I'm sorry. I'm bad with dates, okay? This is why I double check everything. So May of 1992 is really the start date for BMW Motorsport. But let's go back a little bit again to 1969, okay? So 1968, BMW had won the European Touring Car Championship, you know, whatever the 2-liter class was, with the 2002. Naturally aspirated M10 engine. Alex von Falkenhausen is leading that project, leading the team. So for 1969, they want to defend their championship, but they don't have enough power because all of a sudden the Porsche 911 is eligible for that class. So BMW decides to turbocharge the M10. And Paul Rasche, legendary engineer already, actually, is assigned to create that turbocharging program. And that is a really interesting thing because none of these guys actually like turbocharging. You know, they much prefer naturally aspirated engines, but they don't really have a choice because they don't have a bigger engine than the 2-liter. So they put this thing on the dyno, and Paul Rasche says that really almost on the very first run, they knew they had an engine that could be competitive in Formula One. So this is 1969. BMW has been competing in Formula 2. They've actually been building some really interesting Formula 2 engines, But again, you know, their expectations are always being tempered by a lack of money. They're really running on a shoestring. They don't have a lot of resources. They have very few people. But I think this idea gains traction within the racing engine department specifically. And even though they can't execute it, it sort of hangs in the background somewhere, where they know that this M12 engine that gets developed for Formula 2 can be a Formula 1 engine if they can, you know, find the funding and find the corporate approval to make that happen. So now we're back to 72. And when Bob Lutz arrived and starts motorsport, BMW didn't even race in 1971. He reinstituted that program. BMW had actually stopped racing at the end of the 1970 season for a number of reasons. Money was one. Another was the fact that Jochen Rindt had been killed, and that made racing really unpopular in Germany, which seems paradoxical right now that the Germans would ever not like racing. But it really, I think, heightened the fact that racing had gotten really dangerous for the tracks. The speed of the cars had really outgrown tracks like the Nürburgring and like Spa and, you know, some of these other classic tracks. So yeah, just leave it on that one for a second. we'll get to the others. So there's an image just popped up there that we're going to be going in circles a little bit here, because there's really a lot happening at BMW during this time that all feeds into the M1 project. So anyway, they don't go racing at all in 1971. And when Lutz gets there, he says, no, we're going racing again. Starts BMW Motorsport. And the person he hires to run it is Jochen Nerpasch. Jochen Nerpasch was a professional racer throughout the 60s. He won Daytona in 68, driving a Porsche, it was either 907 or 908. I have it in my notes, but anyway, I think it's a 907. He has, in the same year that he wins Daytona for Porsche, he becomes the head of Ford's racing department. And they are racing the Escorts in the European Touring Car Championship. He and his team developed the Ford Capri into what becomes the dominant car in the European Touring Car Championship. And that's the target for BMW. They want to beat the Capri. But BMW has no racing team. So they've been sort of farming it out to Alpina and to AC Schnitzer, who have been campaigning not only the 2002 and the 1602, but they've started racing the 2800 CS. Alpina, of course, turns the 2800 CS into the 3.0 CSL. 1973, BMW Motorsport finally has a real team. They go racing in the European Touring Car Championship with what is really the first BMW Motorsport team. They're racing against and with really Alpina and AC Schnitzer. Schnitzer Motorsport, and BMW wins the championship that year. They win the manufacturing championship, and a couple of and Tony Hesmans is the driver's champion. And that obviously elevates, you know, BMW Motorsport's stature considerably, and the stature of the CSL. 1975 rolls along though, and we have, or 74, some issues with OPEC. The OPEC oil crisis hits, and this OPEC oil crisis has a huge effect on the entire auto industry. It really changes everything, because gas had been cheap. The price of a barrel of oil quadrupled overnight, basically. It had been $3, this is gonna sound crazy, but it had been $3 a barrel, and overnight it was 12, okay? And, you know, it doesn't sound like much today, but obviously a quadrupling of the price of anything is a shock. And, you know, gasoline is not only more expensive, but it's also scarce. So all sorts of things, you know, racing seems superfluous. It's again, politically incorrect to go racing. High performance is also really on the outs in the public eye. This is why the 2002 Turbo was problematic for BMW as well, because they had basically just brought that car out at about the worst possible time. And so the CSLs go to IMSA for 75. They race in IMSA rather than really racing in Europe. And as this is happening, nothing is forever. And I think, everyone within BMW, certainly the chairman, Eberhard von Kuenheim, is aware that, this too shall pass. So they're planning ahead, and they're not necessarily planning ahead for a future which is exclusively, underpowered econoboxes. They know that there will always be customers for high performance cars, whether that means sedans or sports cars. So they carry on with development. Now, the CSL has run its course. It won the European Touring Car Championship in '75, and a lot of privateers were still doing well with it in Europe. It did well in IMSA in '75 and '76, even though it didn't win a championship. But it's at the end of the line. And even as a CSL, that car is heavy. And it also has a lot of frontal area. As I'm sure you know, it looks like a flying brick, especially compared to a Porsche. So Nerposh and Paul Rasha and Martin Braungart, the people at BMW Motorsport, they're really thinking to what is their next move. And the car that succeeded the CSL is the E24 6 Series, bigger and heavier still, not really suitable for top class racing, at least not initially with the smallest engine. But the idea really is that they want to build a car that can compete at the highest level of sports car racing. And that means not just Group 4 racing, but Group 5, which is really for what we would call a supercar, by today's standards. We're talking about, Ferraris, we're talking about some of the wilder Porsches. I don't know what else, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, they don't have anything like that. So Nerposh goes to the board with a presentation, and what he wants to create, what he proposes to create, is a car that will succeed in racing on that level. But it has to do two more things. It has to be a top flight Gran Turismo for the road, because it has to be street legal, it has to be homologated. But the other thing that it plans to do is to take BMW to Formula One. It's going to have a Formula One engine, which is, I'm laughing because it's sort of like, really? That makes no sense. Because a Formula One engine, any real racing engine, is inherently unsuited to street use, because all the power is at the top end. You don't really need a lot of torque in a Formula One car. You don't really need a lot of torque on the track. What you need is horsepower. You need both, obviously, but you give priority to horsepower and to high revs. On the street, it's kind of the opposite. And I think anybody who drove one of the E60 M5s with the V10 engine, you'll know what I mean. It's a really cool engine, but it's not really that streetable. I'm sure people will disagree, and I love high revving engines. So this is not just, a bias for torque. I actually prefer high revving engines, but I will also acknowledge that it's not entirely suited to the street. So the board miraculously approves this, and which actually surprises me that they got this through. And by now Lutz is gone. Lutz has been replaced in '74 by a guy named Hans Erdmann Schonbeck, who turns out to be every bit the enthusiast that Lutz is. So Nerposh has a champion on the board. They managed to get this idea through, and this is the E26. Okay, we all call the M1 the E26, but this car, this first proposal, is really the E26. And interestingly, this is going to be sold for the road as a 9 series. It's going to be over the 7, in terms of prestige, in terms of market position, blah, blah, blah. And what that means is that the thing ends up getting loaded up with stuff. And this is like a natural, it's sort of an inverse entropy for automobiles. And we've all seen this happen. It's like, the customers want this, the customers want that. And so before you know it, what had been a fairly basic car has all this stuff on it, and it weighs a ton. So they quickly realize that this concept that they have shepherded through board approval and done all the cost accounting for is not going to work. And it especially won't work with an F1 engine because it's too heavy for an engine that doesn't have much torque. They're also not really ready with the F1 engine. And, you know, again, let's make a big loop back here. When BMW, when they, I'm sorry, they had actually been forbidden from working on an F1 engine at one point, but they had been forbidden from racing and working on all kinds of racing engines, but they did this sort of in the background. So anyway, I just lost my train of thought. This is what happens when I just talk off the top of my head. But anyway, so they go back to the drawing board. They put the F1 engine aside, and the board at this point, this is when they tell them, you know, okay, no F1 engines. Stop the development of this thing. You've got to use a street engine. And they redesign the whole car. And what they redesign it as is called the E26/1. And that's the car that becomes the M1. And I'm kind of surprised that this isn't really the direction that they went in the beginning, because if the whole idea was to create a car that would compete on the highest level, it almost seems like the second concept is the much more obvious one. You know, that you don't really want to start with a road car. You want to build a car for the racetrack and then make it street legal, because that's much easier and it's also much cheaper. And I'll share with you some numbers in a second. So they borrow the engine essentially from the CSL. They borrow the M49 and they make a few adaptations to that. So here's your engine. It's not an F1 engine. It's based on the M30 Big Six, but you know, it's got 4 valves per cylinder. It has you know, chain drive to the cams to make it a little quieter. It's refined. It's detuned a little bit for the road down to, I want to say, 288 horsepower from, you know, 450 or whatever it had as the M49. And they start conceptualizing, they start developing a tube frame chassis and a really fairly stripped down sports car that is going to be much more like a Porsche 911 RS. And, you know, like I said, I'm kind of surprised they didn't start with that. And I don't fully understand how it evolved into a 9 Series. That has never been adequately explained to me by anything I've read or by anyone I've ever really talked to. So there's a little bit of a mystery that remains there. And if I ever run into Jochen Nerpasch again, I will ask him that specific question and then I'll tell everybody what the answer is. But so again, we have to go back to this issue of production capacity that inspired them to buy the glass plant in the first place back in 1966, okay? So BMW still doesn't have really any excess production capacity, but this car is going to be built in small quantities so they can outsource production. You know, as with the CS, all the E9s were outsourced to CAM, and all the convertibles have long been outsourced to Bauer. So this has never been a problem. This is something that BMW has really done all along, is, you know, keep the sedans, keep the mainstream cars in-house, and then the smaller volume cars, you know, the coupes, the cabriolets, and a few other little things get outsourced to other houses. So Nerpasch has to find a supplier. He talks to Bauer. They really don't have the capacity to do it. He talks to Carmen. They don't have the capacity to do it. So then he goes to Italy and he meets up with Lamborghini. And Lamborghini, they will find the capacity to do it. They have the capability of engineering, you know, of helping to develop the car, of outsourcing, you know, the construction of the frame. They're not going to build the frame themselves. They're really going to serve as an assembly facility. So the frame is going to be outsourced, I think, to a company called Marchesi. The fiberglass body is going to be outsourced to a company that does resins, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So Lamborghini is going to facilitate the development, working with Martin Braungart, getting this whole thing ready, getting it all set up and ready to go, and they're going to build the car and then deliver it. So in the midst of all this, this is all set up. They get through the prototype stage. They build the first prototype. Nerpasch shows it to the board. He has a few cars along with him to show the board, this is what we're aiming at. One is the Maserati Mirac SS. I think one of the others, probably a Ferrari 328. A Pantera. He's got a Pantera GTS and a Porsche Turbo. Okay, so he brings these cars and he shows them all to the board, and the board is thrilled with the M1. It's really quite a success, in terms of its presentation. The board also really likes the styling, and I can't really talk too much about the styling because there's not really a ton to say about it, except that one of the things the board insisted upon is that, and Martin, if you want to flash on the turbo for a second. So back in 1972 for the Olympics, this is a great Bob Letts initiative here with Paul Brock. The Olympics are coming and BMW is erecting this beautiful new 4-cylinder building. And von Kuenheim wants to show the 5 Series. The Olympics are literally happening across the street. If you've ever been to the BMW Welt or, to the museum, that big open space that you see off to your left when you stand at in front of the museum, that's the Olympic Park. And that's where the 1972 Olympics were held in Munich. So Lutz, having come from GM, knows that, the 5 Series, nice as it is not going to make a big splash. First of all, people have already seen it. So what von Kuenheim is going to show them is not just a new 5 Series, but, the new one with the 6-cylinder engine. And they've already seen the one with the 4-cylinder engine. So this is not going to be a big deal. But Lutz really wants to make a splash. And, in his GM tradition, he says, well, if this were GM, we would take this opportunity to really show people something, to really, emphasize, our capabilities and to do something really special. So he borrows some ideas and some technology from General Motors and gives Paul Brock a free hand in designing what is really a safety first supercar. And, if you look at this picture, this is Turbo 1. And what's really cool about it, this is Turbo 2 actually, is that the front is highlighted in this safety orange because this is really the first car with a soft front, a soft nose made of plastic. It's got a few other things like, that really weren't ready for public consumption yet, like, radar assist for, I guess, what do we call it now? Like not stop start, God, I'm blanking, but the cruise control, the active cruise control type of stuff, and the park distance control. So it's got features like that, and it's got this nifty turbocharged engine that he borrowed from the race car of 1969. So anyway, this car was a huge hit. This car was, became like an instant icon. They showed it at the Olympics in '72 that summer. And then in September, they took it to Paris, to the Paris Motor Show. And it was really the hit of the Paris Motor Show. It was on the cover of either Road and Track or Car and Driver. And it really signaled something special from BMW. It signaled a new direction. It's kind of like the Vision Efficient Dynamics when that was shown at Frankfurt. It's just like, whoa, cool. So they wanted to retain some of the styling of this. So the board insisted that when the M1 was designed, it had to take styling cues from the turbo concept. So the person who's going to be designing this car is Giorgetto Giugiaro, who has a company called Ital Design. And he borrows, some of the signature styling elements from the turbo, and if you look at the nose, you can see that, it's got the small kidneys, it's got a very low frontal area. Basic proportions are that of a supercar. Fortunately, he did not stick with the gull wing doors. Those are, they're problematic. The whole reason the turbo had gull wing doors is because Paul Brock didn't like hitting his head on the roof of a supercar, getting in and out of it. So this obviously solved that problem. But he also retained the signature 2 roundels on the tail and the flying buttresses that, that go from the roof to the trailing edge of the trunk. So you can definitely see a very clear lineage, a design lineage between Paul Brock's turbo and Giugiaro's M1. So the board is thrilled and, everything is going swimmingly. And then Lamborghini goes bankrupt. So the whole, the whole Megillah is basically effed. And they, so this is 1970, is this 78 or is this 79? Or this is 78 actually. So they are just about to start production. And the whole deal with the production schedule is that it's, first of all, it's very tight. And it's very tight because BMW wants to race this car in 1979, which means they need to produce 400 examples before the start of the racing season in 1979, which I'm going to say is March. Okay, we're already into 78 and they haven't built any. They're supposed to build 300 that year, starting, I want to say in November, like 100 a month, something like that. And then the next 100 over the, so like 3 a day for the first 4-6 months, something like that. And anyway, that is not going to happen because Lamborghini, their principal production house, is bankrupt. And this is a theme that is happening throughout the Italian auto industry. And I want to turn to world events here for a second, because I think that we ascribe chaos to Italians all too readily. And I don't think it's really justified because, first of all, Lamborghini was owned by 2 Swiss guys at this time. It was not owned by Ferruccio Lamborghini anymore. He had sold the company a few years earlier to 2 Swiss enthusiasts. I don't even know who they were or where they came from. But anyway, they ended up buying the company. And they're the ones who really ran it into the ground. They had contracted to build this, some sort of military vehicle called the Cheetah. And there were major problems with creating that. The prototype was destroyed in an accident. And so a lot of the money that BMW was paying Lamborghini to develop and produce the M1 ends up getting siphoned off into this Cheetah project. You know, and certainly from Lamborghini's perspective, that's understandable because a military contract is going to be hugely profitable compared to building, 400 supercars for BMW. But on the other hand, it wreaks havoc with BMW because BMW's money is now going into another project and the M1 isn't getting built. So Nirpash's feet are really being held to the fire by this because he is, he's the executive in charge of this project and he has to deliver a car, that will, basically save his job, save BMW Motorsport and fulfill all these promises for marketing, etc. So Lamborghini, but again, it's like this isn't a situation that's unique to Lamborghini. A lot of Italian industry is being racked by financial difficulties caused by labor unrest and also caused by a political situation which was really a holdover from World War II, which is really a low simmering civil war. There were issues at the end of World War II that were never fully resolved, political issues that were never fully resolved, that really affected Italian society going forward. Because again, if you don't reach a conclusion and you allow opposing factions to, keep committing acts of violence against one another, you will have problems that go on for decades. And what you really saw in Italy is this probably didn't even resolve itself until into the 1980s. So Lamborghini had been building cars like the Countach, and all of a sudden, because of this political upheaval, as well as some economic difficulties, they don't have a domestic market anymore. Italians really stopped buying flashy cars because it's dangerous to drive a flashy car. There are a lot of kidnappings happening. There's a lot of animosity being directed toward so-called captains of industry. The labor unrest situation is really, it's widespread. It's deeply politicized. And if you want to look up something really interesting, I don't know if a lot of you are old enough to remember the murder of Aldo Moro, who had been the prime minister of Italy. And this is all part and parcel of that time in Italy that, again, it was sort of the butt of a lot of jokes because they had, you know, really one prime minister after another. You know, they had something like 31 prime ministers in 10 years or something crazy like that. I'm exaggerating, but anyway, people were doing the best they could. And, you know, a lot of companies went out of business. A lot of companies went bankrupt. Lamborghini really, you know, fell into a trough that was hard for them to get out of. But anyway, when they collapsed, some of their employees turned around and created another company. And that was, I gotta find the name of it now. I'm forgetting the name of the company that they created in order to basically keep building this car. Ital Engineering, it was called. So there's a group of employees, key people really at Lamborghini, who form Ital Engineering in order to keep the M1 project on track and to, you know, to make sure that BMW eventually got its car. And they made sure that the chassis was still being manufactured by Marchesi and that the fiberglass company was still delivering the body. But they didn't have a production facility. So the interesting thing here is that Giorgetto Giugiaro, who was the designer of the car, his company is called Ital Design. And he did kind of a remarkable thing here. He really turned around and became a manufacturer. His company had never built a car before, but he somehow set up production facilities to assemble these parts into a rolling chassis that could then be delivered. Again, they have to scramble, you know, that could then be delivered to Bauer in Stuttgart, where the drivetrain is going to be installed. And then from Bauer in Stuttgart, the car goes to Garking to BMW Motorsport, where everything is supposed to be just checked over, and then the cars are delivered. Let's see if I'm getting out of order here. Okay, so this is obviously, you know, it's a borderline disaster that ends up sort of working out okay, at least on paper. And, you know, they're going to get the cars, but they're not going to be ready in time. There's no way this is going to be homologated in time for the start of the '79 race season because the delays have already cost it that opportunity. The other thing that's happened is the car has gotten a lot more expensive. It was supposed to be sold for 80,000 Deutschmarks, which was about $40,000 at the time. And now it's going to cost 100,000 Deutschmarks. So you've got a 25% increase in the retail price. But even then, that isn't really the true price. And the only way they can sell it for 100,000 Deutschmarks is to limit the number of dealers who want to sell the car and to ensure that the service is done by those dealers exclusively so that they have an opportunity to recoup some of their lost profit by servicing the M1s. So that's going to happen. But Nerpash, and in the photo that you're seeing on your screen right now, that's Paul Rasha on the right in the yellow shirt and Jochen Nerpash on the left. So the big purpose of this car, and the thing that his job really rests upon is getting this car onto the racetrack. Okay, well, it's not going to happen for Group 5. It's not going to happen for Group 4 in 1979. BMW has nothing to race. They can't keep racing the CSL. The 6 Series isn't really competitive. So he happens to be sitting in a Munich bar with Max Mosley. And they come up, and I don't even know if Max Mosley is the head of the FIA. He must be involved with the FIA at some point. But he had a long relationship with BMW because he was involved with March Engineering, which BMW had worked with in Formula 2. But anyway, they are having drinks in a Munich bar, and they either together or Nerpash come up with the idea of the Pro Car series. And I think this is brilliant. You know, when you think about like, okay, what kind of publicity are you really going to get from a Group 4 race win? Okay, some primarily from enthusiasts, but what Procar is going to do is Procar is going to run as a support class to Formula One. On every Formula One, there's Paul Rocha again, there's the engine, there's a Procar. So it's going to run as a support class to F1 throughout 1979 at every race. And the drivers are going to be the top 5 Formula One drivers in points, plus some of the leading lights from sports car racing, F2, Junior Series, GTs. So it's really going to be an all-star cast of drivers all duking it out in identically prepared M1 Pro cars, which have, I think, 470 horsepower, better aerodynamics. They're real race cars. They're not like, you know, a street, they're not the street version of the M1. They're a lot more powerful. They're a lot more specialized. And it's really a pretty exciting idea. And they managed to get this thing off the ground. They take the first 25 cars off the, you know, line, so to speak, and they deliver them to 3 race teams. They deliver them to Project 4, which is Ron Dennis's company at the time in England. They deliver it to Osella in Italy and to BMW Motorsport in Garking. And they managed to get this fleet of 25 Pro cars to the starting line at Zolder, I think is the first race, in May. And it runs throughout the F1 season. People love it. Niki Lauda wins the first championship. And, you know, they persuaded these guys to participate by actually offering, you know, real money, like enough money for a race win for a championship that an F1 driver would be tempted to do this. And they got great participation, you know, and it was hugely popular. So they run that in 1979. And then, of course, by 1980, the car is ready for Group 4 and Group 5. But I don't really want to talk too much about the racing thing. Let's go back to the engine, okay? So as you recall, that's the M88, okay? So not that engine, but the other one, the original one, the F1 engine, Paul Rasche, okay? It's Paul Rasche's engine. He probably hated that picture. He's probably never fatter than that in his life, but anyway, he had actually done something really interesting. After the original M26 project was basically, you know, shit canned from BMW, they knew they still had an F1 engine that wasn't quite ready for racing. So he sends the M12 over to the United States to McLaren Performance Engines, McLaren North America, where Wiley McCoy and someone else whose name I forget, develop it into the M12/9, which is the car that the 320 Turbo raced in IMSA with David Hobbs. And that was really a development program for F1, because the cool thing about Paul Rasche that he kind of got from Alex von Falkenhausen, but I think also from you know, his temperament in particular, is planning ahead. And Alex von Falkenhausen's trip was always, don't build the engine you need today. Build the engine you're going to need several years from now. That's why the engines of this period, the M10 and the M30, are so robust and were so easily hot rodded. Because, you know, he gave them more bearings, he gave them stronger, you know, crankcases and cylinder blocks. You know, they're really overbuilt engines. So anyway, the M12/9 becomes the M12/13. And BMW has an F1 engine, okay? It's not going to be, you know, it's not going into the M1, obviously, but it's pretty much ready. You know, it's really ready to go. So, but that hasn't happened at BMW. That's happened a little bit at BMW. It's mostly happened in Livonia, Michigan at McLaren. So anyway, Nerpash and Rocha probably both really want to race F1, but it's not going to happen at BMW. And in 1980, in early 1980, Nerpash is basically, he's approached by Talbot, which is part of PSA, the big French automotive conglomerate, to create an F1 program for Talbot. And he says yes. And he approaches a few engine makers, one of them is BMW, about supplying an F1 engine to the Talbot project. So by this time, you know, BMW has its F1 engine pretty darn close to ready. And BMW is asked to provide an engine for Talbot's F1 project. and they agree in principle. And the contract is sent over to be signed. And one of the people who has to sign this contract is Paul Rasche. The contract is in French, which Paul Rasche does not speak. And he says, I'm not signing this until this is translated into German. And I think that's smart. You know? Never sign a contract you can't read. So anyway, when he finally sees the contract in a language he reads, he realizes that Talbot is not just getting use of the M12/9 or /13, whatever the Formula One engine is called at that specific point. They're getting the M12, period. All of this intellectual property that Paul Rasche and his team have developed over really the last 14 years, something like that, starting with the Applebeck-headed M12 for Formula 2, that's all going to be basically sold outright to Talbot. Well, as you might imagine, you know, he's not happy about that. So he talks to Eberhard von Kuenheim, who is the CEO of BMW, and they fly to Paris to meet with the head of PSA. And, you know, I think the guy at PSA thinks this is merely a formality. We're going to have this signing ceremony. We'll sip some champagne. But whatever the head of PSA says to von Kuenheim, the deal is off. They don't sign. Rasche and von Kuenheim leave. And as they're leaving, you know, as they're heading back to Munich, von Kuenheim says to Rasche, that man will never have our engine. So in one fell swoop, BMW is going F1 racing. Von Kuenheim specifically is so outraged by whatever happened in this meeting that all the prohibitions that BMW had against going F1 racing, which are probably mostly about cost, are suddenly gone. And they're going to not only, you know, race in F1, they want to beat Talbot and they want to beat everybody else. And that's exactly what they do. And by 1983, they are F1 world champions. But before we get to 1983 and the F1 World Championship, and again, this is a convoluted story. There's nothing straightforward about the tale of the M1. So it's 1980, Nerpasch leaves. Okay, well, this project is not done. The project basically falls into Rasche's lap, you know, and von Kuenheim is like, you know, you finish it. So he does, and it's kind of fascinating because I think that, you know, one of the things to bear in mind about Paul Rasche is that he's an engine guy. He's not, and you know, he runs the department, yes, but at this point in his career, he's like a numbers engineer. He's a passionate experimental engineer of racing engines. He's not a manager necessarily. He's not, and he's never worked on a series production car in his life. You know, he's always been on the racing side. I mean, he may have, you know, done a little of this and a little of that for cars that, you know, for series production cars, but that's not really his forte. He's a racing engine designer. So the M1 project is dumped in his lap, and he has to not only ensure continuity of the supply chain, but he realizes that quality control is terrible, that the assembly isn't really done, that the cars are not to a BMW standard really in any respect. So once he takes over in probably, let's say, early to mid 1980, you know, if you own an M1, I think you probably want one that was built after Paul Rasche came in, because it's probably a much better car, because he's the one who's really ensuring that assembly is done correctly, that when the cars leave, they're actually finished products. And actually, there's one thing I forgot to mention about Giugiaro and about Italdesign, which is that, you know, yes, he designed it, and yes, Italdesign, you know, did a lot of the initial assembly. There's another thing that I just discovered that they were involved with, which was actually building the car's interior. They created the dashboards and a lot of the interior things that you see in the car. And admittedly, it's not a ton of stuff, but I didn't realize that they had built that rather than gotten it from a supplier. I mean, today, you know, you would buy a dashboard assembly, you would buy seats, but apparently they built all that stuff, you know, in-house at Etal Design, which is pretty cool. So anyway, so Rasha has to take over this M1 project. Now, at the same time, you know, he's also getting this F1 project off the ground, partnering with Brabham and working with Gordon Murray to create F1 cars. They start racing in 1981. Yeah, I think 1981. And that's, you know, that's a major task, trying to get a, you know, really F1's first turbocharged engine to not blow up every time they take to the track, making competitive power, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it all works out. And we have the M1 and we have an F1 world champion in 1983 for BMW with Nelson Piquet and the Brabham BT52. And the M1, you know, it's kind of interesting because it's really forgotten in all this. You know, at BMW, it's, you know, once this racing program for the M1 really fails to take off, and once BMW turns its attention to Formula One, the M1 is kind of the redheaded stepchild, and they really lose interest in the project. I think that's at least what Nerposh told me. He thought that BMW really lost interest. I think they didn't really have the resources, but I also think that the car lays so far outside the norm, you know, tube frame chassis, limited production, elaborate and somewhat ridiculous production chain, you know, a lot of outside involvement. You know, it wasn't really a BMW project, you know, and also by now Martin Braungart is gone too. You know, he had come to BMW. I have to apologize if this seems incoherent, that I'm jumping around from all kinds of things because I'm just talking, you know, and this is sort of what having a conversation with me is like too. So anyway, Braungart is gone. So he's not really there to shepherd the project through. And he was the guy who really designed the chassis and who, you know, who did a lot of the development work with a lot of the race car drivers that made the car drivable and raceable. So the car is really forgotten, and that's how it ends up being kind of this one-off, you know, outlier car within the larger context of BMW sports cars. They don't really pursue this project further. They don't keep it in production really any longer than they need to. They needed to build 400 cars for homologation. They built 453, and because so many of those were purpose-built road cars, they couldn't, purpose-built race cars, they couldn't just stop at 400. You know, and then it's done. Poof, no more M1, and sort of an instant collectible, although it wasn't an instant collectible, as I'm sure a lot of you know. I remember when I started editing Bimmer back in 1999, an M1 went for about $60,000. And it's not 60,000 now. You know, if you had bought one back then, you could definitely, you know, get your money back on it today in any condition. I think the car has really, you know, gained in appreciation over time, but, you know, it's in a way, it's really a shame that they didn't continue with it or with something like it, because one of the things that Nerposh told me the first time I interviewed him was really interesting. It was a vision that he had had of, you know, what we effectively see in sports car racing today, especially in, you know, sort of the amateur classes or the, you know, like a GTD, a Pro-Am type of class, where you have a lot of Porsches. You know, you have Porsche Cup, you've got, you know, Porsches racing at really every level of sports car racing. And the reason for that is because they will sell you a race car. You know, they'll sell you an RS that you don't have to do a lot to in order to have a competitive race car. Well, BMW doesn't do that. I mean, they kind of do it with the M4 GTS, GT4, but not so much. And he had some interesting numbers. Okay, so what he said was that a standard M1 road car cost 100,000 Deutschmarks. The Group 4 Pro car cost 150,000 Deutschmarks. If that's, you know, okay, 50% more, that's not a lot. 50,000 more Deutschmarks. And I think at the time it was probably 2.5 to the dollar, something like that. But he drew an interesting comparison, which was that a 3 Series road car at the time cost 30,000 Deutschmarks. Building that car into a race car cost 750,000 Deutschmarks. And I think he's talking about probably E21 and, turning that into a Group 4 racer. So it's exponentially more expensive to turn a series production road car into a competitive race car than it is to take a limited production, barely street legal race car and turn it into a competitive racer. So from a cost standpoint, it's much more effective. That used to be Peter Gleason's car, which he no longer owns. But anyway, I don't know if he's here today, but he said he might drop in. But anyway, Peter, there's your car. So anyway, he had envisioned, fields of BMWs to rival the fields of Porsches that we see in sports car racing today. And I think that would have been a really cool idea. I think, we root for guys like Turner Motorsport and RLL, obviously, but that's a factory effort, and Bimmer World Racing, because there really aren't a lot of BMWs. We now have the M2 Racing or the M235i, whatever it is called in its current iteration. But it's only been very recently that they've really built customer race cars. And I think that, as a BMW loyalist, it would have been really cool to see more BMWs in sports car racing at all levels, that people could do more effectively, from an engineering standpoint, that would be more ready to race and that would be more cost effective to turn into a racer. So anyway, that was kind of an interesting vision. And that is really where we wind up the story of the M1. And I'm sure that I see some Q&As in there. Maybe Martin can pop in and see if there are any questions, or if there's anything anyone would like me to go back over after I raced through that at blinding speed.
It's a wonder the car ever got built at all, Jackie, with all of the twists and turns and the intrigue and the false starts and everything else. It's quite amazing. The only open question we have at the moment is from Fred Larimer, who's wondering if there are any M1 owners actually here attending the meeting. If there are, love it if you could go down to the Q&A section and just give us a comment on the build quality of your car, or any other insights that you might have that we can then share back with the larger group.
Well, I can address that actually from the standpoint, I've driven 4, maybe 5 different, maybe 6 different M1s, and not all of them have been restored. Certainly when they're restored, they're magnificent. And I know it's really, really difficult. You can always tell an unrestored M1 too, because they don't look as nice. The fiberglass quality is not ideal. The paint usually looks pretty bad. Literally, you can tell at a glance if that car is original or if it's been tidied up. But they're fun to drive. It's funny because I've driven a lot of Ferraris, but later ones, not of that era. And I think if you look at the numbers, the cars are, the M1 homage. Okay, that's actually, we can get to that in a second, but that's sort of an interesting, here's the M1, regular M1. Campagnolo wheels, unique to the car. One of the solutions that Giugiaro came up with that's really pretty cool, if you look at the back of the car, see the louvers that are on the buttresses that go to the rear. Well, obviously, the basic supercar shape, the wedge shape of the low frontal area and the higher back, is more aerodynamically efficient. And it also allowed him to situate the M88 engine where it should be. It's a very tall engine for a supercar. I think, Ferrari was doing V8s. I think Maserati probably was too. So, those engines, being arrayed like this are obviously, not like this, so they don't have as much height inherently. So that was a technical problem that I think Giugiaro solved in a really effective way by just making the deck lid high enough. And it also created, sound aerodynamics for the car. And he also, there's another thing that that he retained, which is the Hofmeister kink, which is kind of probably presented a certain amount of challenge, because he had to retain certain BMW design cues, not only from the turbo, but just from series production cars, things that identify it as a BMW. One is the double kidney grille, and the other is the Hofmeister kink in the rear window. And I think he did a nice job. You can see where the cut line is for the lid, for the top, and that meets it in a really nice spot where it's not too obtrusive and it doesn't feel like it's just bisecting it in an awkward place.
Jackie, I was curious here when you mentioned how the Pro Car series came into being. I think at that time, Max Mosley, if I remember correctly, he was the legal advisor for the Formula One Constructors Association.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. He definitely had a role to play in F1 organization, but I'm not sure I don't think he was FIA president yet.
No, he wasn't. He was Bernie Eccleston's right-hand man, and that was the whole era of Eccleston versus Balestra and the FIA versus Poker.
Okay, yeah. But one of the things that about the Italian car industry, even today, okay, Fiat is a huge conglomerate, but the companies that BMW was going after with this car, specifically Maserati and Ferrari, they're tiny. I think to this day, Ferrari builds, fewer than 5,000. I mean, I think at one point they got up to 7,000 cars, but I think they're somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 cars, maybe 4,000 per year. It's a tiny company. Maserati, Maserati's factory is like, not even as big as a lot of our houses. It's minuscule. These companies have a really outsized position in the public imagination because they've achieved so much, well-publicized racing success, and because they've got these legendary figures at the helm. The Enzo Ferraris, the Alfieris, all these guys. These are tiny companies. If you look at where, the production line of Ferrari, it's like a workshop. Even today, Maserati is it's tiny. Lamborghini, I think at the time they had 300 employees, something like that. It's not very many. BMW had 3,000 in 1945, when they were, practically dead, so.
Jackie, we got a few questions here. So one question from M Dub is, what's the approximate number of road cars that still exist? Do you have any idea of that?
Ooh, I don't know, but I would assume it's most of them. The person who would know is Mike Jouret. If Mike is here today, he could tell you that right off the top of his head. They built 453 altogether, and I think 399 of those were road cars, and I would assume that most of them are still around. I know of one that burned in the Oakland Hills fire. I have parts of it actually in the closet here. If I had remembered, I would have gotten them out. It's possible that even that car was resurrected, though, with a new engine, and because to resurrect a car, all you need is a chassis number. So
I thought I remembered seeing something where somebody who was restoring an M1 had put together a couple of them and then used the body from what was left over of the other one to turn it into a wall-mounted homage of some sort.
Yeah.
That may have been the Oakland fire car. But this is interesting for me because Chris Oke, or Oke, I apologize, Chris, if I'm mispronouncing your name. He says that he saw the turbo concept at the LA Auto Expo in 72, 73, and as a teenager, it made a big impression of him. For me, it was kind of the same way. I remember reading about this. My father subscribed to Motorsport magazine, and Bill Boddy, who was the then editor, related the whole story of the M1 in motorsport as it was happening, and it was quite quite the intrigue and quite the it was presented, as you imagine the Brits would, it was presented as being quite damning of the Italians and all of the shambolic nature of the Italian manufacturing and Italian politics and everything else.
And I really do think that this is deeply unfair. And, and I don't want to get, too deeply into the politics, but, a lot of the chaos, like I said, a lot of this had never been resolved after World War II. Once the Germans left, once the Nazi army withdrew from Italy, there was still fighting going on, and the U.S. took sides. And a lot of the U.S. foreign policy, which translated into military aid as well as economic aid, in the, really from the time of the end of World War II through, I don't know, today probably, although the communist, bear is seeming less of a threat, but the U.S. was obsessed with stopping the spread of communism. And countries like Greece and Italy had these civil wars, really, that broke out at the end of World War II. And, because these issues were never resolved politically, and because certain groups were excluded from the public sphere, they didn't have an opportunity to reach an organic resolution. And I think that really hindered Italy's ability, and certainly Greece's ability, to have political stability much earlier than they actually achieved it. And that, that created chaos for industry as well. I mean, you can't have a high functioning industrial economy without clear policy, without, public safety, without adequate public investment in, things like training and education. And, but political stability is really important. You can't have chaos and have sound industrial policy. It won't work.
Right. It was a tumultuous time.
Yeah, but you can't ignore the fact that the U.S. had a hand in that. It wasn't just Italians fighting with each other. There were, the Soviets were fighting, a proxy war, and so were we. So,
Welcome back to the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's about all we have time for tonight, Jackie. Thank you very much indeed. It's been enlightening, and the twists and turns I knew something about them, but nothing like as much as that. I just have a couple of things that I'd like to mention at the end, aside from thanking you very much for doing this. But
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
You have a new book coming out that you mentioned when we were talking prior to this.
I do have a new book coming out. I worked on the cover design last night, and that's really the last thing I need to do, and then sort out a few details and then upload it for publication. But as Martin mentioned, I have published a couple of books on my own, and it is published through Amazon. They're not in your local bookstore unless your bookstore buys them directly through Amazon and makes a bulk purchase. But they're available from Amazon. This book is called BMW in the 20th Century, The People and Products That Made the Company. And it's a year-by-year series of vignettes that introduce either a character or a product. And together, I think there are 180 of them, something like that, 177. Of these 2-page vignettes with photographs and stories about, the key people in the BMW story, key products as they appear. And I'm talking about aero engines, motorcycles, and cars. And it's sort of a nonlinear history. It's a chronological history, but it's not meant to be read, from start to finish. It's not a single narrative. It's 180 narratives. So you can pick it up and, flip open to anything, and each story should make sense on its own. But I think it'll be fun for people to read. I think you'll enjoy it. And that should be out within a couple of weeks. I mean, if not sooner. I have other things to do, unfortunately, so I kind of have to, do the work that people are paying me for. But anyway, it's almost done, and it will definitely be ready for the holiday shopping season. But yeah, I think it'll be fun, and I think I think people will enjoy it, and I I really had fun doing it. I think at this stage it's not fun anymore. At this stage you're just like, oh, get off my desk, book. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting project, and it will. It's somewhat like the column I do in Roundel, but it's not really. And it's somewhat like the Bimmer back page, which is what originally inspired it. I loved doing the Bimmer back page, and when we stopped publishing Bimmer, I immediately thought it would be really cool to put these into a book, but I didn't have enough. And I certainly didn't have enough stories from the back page, and I still didn't have enough stories after doing the column for Roundel for 4 years. So it's, I had to do a lot more, but now I have a pretty relatively thorough collection of stories that start in 1911 and run through 1999. And the rest will have to wait for another book.
Once you have, once it's up and running, Jackie, send us a link to the to Amazon, and then we'll send that out to all the participants today, so they have the opportunity to put it on their Christmas list, or just buy it for themselves, or
whatever holiday one celebrates.
Indeed.
Yeah. Or even just for everyday reading, you know.
Better yet.
Yeah.
But we'll wrap it up there. I have just a couple of things to mention. First of all, thank you everybody who's attended this. Really, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Jackie is a font of knowledge and detail that is just both mind-boggling and also just incredible fun to listen to, and help to water all these little pieces that we pick up over the years of information. Eventually the Shaggy Dog story starts to make sense. BMW seems to be an ongoing Shaggy Dog story. Yeah. But the M chapter, we do have a couple more events coming up that I'd like to briefly mention here before we wrap up. One is we have another virtual event like this coming up next month on the 10th of December with Mike Renner from the Performance Center, who will be telling us all about the programs they have there, and about his probably the best job in the whole world that he has down there, and about some other interesting things that we'll unveil during that meeting. So I would encourage you to sign up. The link for that will be live tomorrow. We'll send that out to everybody who's attended. And then finally, a plug for the MX1 Fest, which is coming up in April 2021, assuming the world hasn't ended by then. But assuming it's happening, and we're planning accordingly. We're planning to, as part of that, MX1 will feature M cars and X cars, but the M chapter, we're planning some specific events around that. Some are still in the planning stage. I can't talk about them quite yet, but by December the 10th, there may be some news on that front. And otherwise, we'll have, we're hoping to put together a tour of M chapter members to tour around the local area, and also to have some caravans of chapter members to head down to the event as well, which should be a fun opportunity to hopefully socialize. And if it needs to be socially distanced, then so be it. But we'll at least get to see each other and know each other a little better. So that's it for tonight. Thank you all again very much. Jackie, thank you so much. Very much. Thank you for having me. Thanks. And thanks for creating this chapter. I think it's really cool. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yep. So that's it. Good night, everyone. Have a good what's left of the weekend, and please sign up and attend the next one. Bye. Bye. Bye.